Hey everyone, and welcome to a special Universal News Frontier Explainer. Today we're diving deep into a scenario that literally rewired the entire global industrial landscape overnight, the 2026 Silicon Siege. We live in this hyper-modern world, completely built on microscopic technology, right? We just kind of assume that our global supply chains are always going to be stable, predictable, and open for business. Well, as we'll see today, that assumption got absolutely shattered. This isn't just a story about trade tariffs or economics. It is about the extreme fragility of our modern way of life. So let's break down exactly how this unprecedented crisis actually unfolded. To understand how this all started, we have to look at this staggering number, $47.5 billion. That represents the massive size of China's Big Fund Phase 3. While the rest of the world was hyper-focused on export controls, this financial engine was just quietly bankrolling a massive global paradigm shift. This wasn't your standard investment fund, guys. This was essentially a war chest, designed specifically to achieve absolute technological sovereignty and mandate that their domestic data centers run entirely on locally produced chips. And seeing that immense funding leads us directly to a pretty terrifying question. What actually happens when the digital nervous system of the modern world is severed? For decades, the US and the global economy relied on this super efficient, just-in-time delivery model. We just assumed parts would arrive exactly when we needed them. But the events of 2026 totally exposed the systemic fragility of that entire architecture. We are essentially looking at the definitive end of the just-in-time era, replaced literally overnight by structural volatility and severed supply lines. Let's move to Section 1, the catalyst, SMIC's sub-5 nanometer breakthrough. What you're seeing here represents sheer engineering defiance. For a long time, the West firmly believed that by denying China access to extreme ultraviolet or EUV lithography machines, they'd be permanently stuck behind the tech curve. But Chinese engineers actually bypassed those Western embargoes. They used older, deep ultraviolet machines combined with a crazy complex technique called self-aligned quadruple patterning, or SAQP. Now, as you can see, SMIC is only getting a 35% yield compared to TSMC's 82%. That means they're throwing away a ton of wasted silicon, but the point is, they achieved the necessary transistor densities anyway. But check out that 1.5x cost multiplier. Because of that incredibly complex multi-patterning technique and the low yield rate, these 5-nanometer class chips cost roughly 50% more to produce than their Western equivalents. Now, in a normal market economy, that kind of margin is a total failure. But remember that $47 billion fund we just talked about? That's where it comes into play. Beijing heavily subsidized this massive economic trade-off just to ensure their technological sovereignty couldn't be blocked by Western embargoes. All right, Section 2, the offensive, embargoes and cyber warfare. In April 2026, we saw a shockingly rapid succession of precision cyber strikes on Silicon Valley's absolute crown jewels. Just look at this timeline. Bam! April 6th, state-sponsored actors infiltrate NVIDIA. 4 days later, they grab Qualcomm's 5G blueprints. By the 12th, Intel's firmware is compromised, which affected 30% of enterprise servers globally. And then the kicker, on April 17th, OpenAI's unredacted model weights are leaked directly to competitors. This was definitely not just random hacking. It was an industrialized, escalating effort to leapfrog Western R&D by completely compromising our digital supply chains. The really crucial point here is how they formalized this offensive. Orders 834 and 835 laid the legal architecture for the May 2026 embargo. Basically, they created a malicious entity list that forced Western firms into an impossible corner. They had to choose: comply with U.S. export controls or maintain access to the massive Chinese market. Beijing systematically weaponized its new monopoly, and not just in chip production, but in the crucial final assembly and packaging stages where they hold dominant global market share. To put the real-world impact of that into perspective, consider this number, 70%. When China retaliated, they issued export restrictions on Nexperia's Chinese facilities. The immediate result? 70% of European-produced power chips instantly stalled. They were effectively blacked out because they relied entirely on China for final assembly and packaging. It's a perfect example of how one localized political move can instantly cascade into a massive, catastrophic supply disruption. Which leads us directly into Section 3, the defense crisis and the paralyzing of America's military. Think about America's premier military platform, the F-35 fighter jet. This aircraft is effectively a data center with wings, running over 8 million lines of code. But it's being strangled by dual choke points. On one side, it needs over 400 kilograms of processed rare earth elements, and China controls roughly 90% of that processing market. On the flip side, It desperately relies on advanced 5 to 7 nanometer semiconductors that the US just doesn't manufacture onshore. Caught right in the middle of this embargo, the US suddenly couldn't replenish the vital hardware required to keep these jets in the air. And unfortunately, the F-35 wasn't alone here. Next-generation platforms across the board were compromised. We're talking Virginia-class submarines, Arleigh-Burke destroyers, and hypersonic missiles that absolutely require advanced chips to make real-time trajectory corrections. But honestly, perhaps the most concerning impact was on collaborative combat aircraft, or autonomous drone swarms. Without that advanced silicon, the processing latency for these drones increased so much that they became entirely vulnerable to basic electronic warfare. It effectively handed a massive advantage right back to our adversaries. Next up, Section 4, the physical choke points, or what we call the energy silicon nexus. Let's walk through exactly how this physical cascade happened, step by step. A joint military campaign in the Middle East, dubbed Operation Epic Fury, triggered a massive physical choke point. Step 1, it halted helium exports out of Qatar. Step 2, fabs in Taiwan and South Korea immediately had to ration their helium, which they desperately need for cooling high-precision photolithography tools. Step 3, that rationing caused pressure fluctuations, leading to massive immediate yield losses of silicon wafers. And finally, Step 4, output volumes plummeted, bringing global chip deliveries to a screeching halt. To make matters worse, that exact same Middle Eastern conflict caused a huge energy shock. A blockade at the Strait of Hormuz instantly wiped out 20% of the global liquefied natural gas supply. That sent electricity costs absolutely skyrocketing for those incredibly energy-intensive semiconductor fabs in Asia. They were literally put in a position where they had to choose between residential heating for citizens and commercial chip production. Meanwhile, back in the United States, the energy crisis was showing up a bit differently. 2,100. That is the massive number of gigawatts absolutely stuck in data center interconnection queues in the US. Because we simply lacked the physical infrastructure, basic things like transformers, these huge AI capacity goals that were slated for 2026 had to be severely pushed all the way back to 2028. Let's look at the long-term aftermath in Section 5, the new normal, and our fractured global supply chains. Faced with this total lack of advanced chips, global industries went into full-blown panic mode, resulting in what's now called the legacy pivot. Engineers were literally frantically ripping up blueprints for cutting-edge avionics and industrial controllers, just trying to force them to run on stockpiled older 28 or 40 nanometer chips. To actually make this work, they had to accept much larger thermal signatures and massive power draws. Suddenly, a readily available, clunky older chip became infinitely more valuable than an advanced 5 nanometer chip that only existed on a blocked invoice. And this brilliantly illustrates where we ended up, the structural rewiring of the globe into new isolated technoblocks. We are definitely no longer operating in a unified global market. China is pushing its triple output strategy for total self-reliance. The United States is desperately trying to onshore its manufacturing through the CHIPS Act. And the EU, they are attempting to carve out their own specific ecosystem around edge AI. We're looking at a world permanently fractured into non-interoperable, fiercely competitive dual ecosystems that are just fighting for sheer material sovereignty. Which brings us to a really deeply sobering realization outlined by defense analysts during this whole crisis. They noted, the jet that wins is not the one that turns the fastest, but the one that thinks the fastest. Let that sink in for a second. That thought process is governed entirely by the silicon forged in the world's most contested factories. Future dominance simply isn't just about firepower anymore. It relies absolutely on secure, uninterrupted access to advanced semiconductors. So I want to leave you with this final vital question to really chew on. In a fractured world full of severed supply lines, how will you build resilience into your silicon foundations? The Silicon Siege of 2026 proved that decentralized intelligence and material sovereignty are the absolute new normal. If factories and national infrastructure aren't treated as hardened assets with deeply secure supply lines, they're going to be the first to fall in this new era of hybrid warfare. Thank you so much for joining me for this Universal News Frontier Special Explainer. I really hope it gave you some crucial perspective on the invisible digital fault lines shaping our modern world. Catch you next time.
An investment in knowledge pays the best interest, so why not invest in this channel? Click like and subscribe for more.